This is your first solo at Droog.
Yes, yeah.
How do you feel about this?
Honoured, very honoured. We've always admired Droog, and yeah, so to have our first solo show here is a real honour.
To have a chance and the space to be able to show a collection of works and kind of gives us a sense of these are the connections we can see in our own work with fresh eyes in a way which it's hard to see in a group show.
And we are sitting at the table called Refuge for Resurgence. I saw this table at the Venice Biennale, as you know.
Yeah.
At that time, I was making an exhibition, and this table fitted perfectly in the exhibition.
Yeah.
Can you tell about it?
All the components were put together from different members of the team. One of our members of the team was working in the Orkney Isles in Scotland, and she was foraging beaches and looking for pieces to put all these pieces of cutlery together. And even the wood that we used to make the table was from an old oak tree that had grown naturally and died. So all these kind of elements came together, and I think it's got a place in our heart. With there's a story for every element.
For me, it was a lot of love for making things.
Yeah,
and I read in your biography that you feel like a maker.
The materiality of things is really important, and even when we're thinking about the future and thinking about future technologies, often we're trying to find a way to kind of get a sense of the materiality of that technology and get hands-on with that and really kind of get a feel for something rather than it being, in the abstract.
A lot of the thinking behind the table emerged from a manifesto or a field guide we had just written at that point called Moving Towards a More Than Human Politics. And we were really interested in how interdependence with other species can really change our perspectives and perhaps move us from this extractive relationship we have with nature as a resource to nature as a companion, as something that we are all part of. Humans love to gather around food. Every culture loves to gather around food. Why is it just humans? Why don't we invite all the other species to gather around?
And whereas the table is quite symbolic, the window is more of a kind of a direct interpretation of how we might imagine a city that has been through climate catastrophe but is kind of being rebuilt.
And is it about building a new world after the catastrophe?
Exactly.
I think it is as well, but it is not to say that, at any point in our lives, suddenly we'll have a clean slate and from which a future will emerge.
We often say that the ecological crisis that we're in and climate change isn't so much a problem that can be solved. It's more of a predicament we need to navigate.
We are all entangled. Without the bee, without the lichen, without the wolf, we really cannot continue to exist. Humans cannot exist. So we need to acknowledge that. I think as a studio, our aesthetic is not very strict. There's a little bit of messiness and there's a little bit of friction intentionally at times because the worlds we inhabit are complex and messy.
Even before I met Anab, kind of embodied this idea of jugaad, which is an Indian word of kind of making do with the things at hand and allowing those to kind of guide you in some way. And I think the other aspect of that is that we often work with the future and a lot of exploring the future, and a lot of ideas around the future are of like a clean white slate. Like the future is this new destination where we start afresh. And in actual fact, it's the opposite. It's true. The future is older, and it's everything we have now plus all the complexities between where we are now and where we've been and where we'll get to. So I think there's something very specific in wanting to embody that.
We think of the future as much as a material. So the wood is the material, but for us the future is the material. And it's not one future, there are many possible futures. And they will all have atoms in them as much as bits. And we are interested in both the bits and the atoms and where they collide and where the tensions happen.
The last film you made is about this polarization in life.
That film really brought us to this kind of point of tension where there was a desire to create something that felt hopeful. And the more we were looking at the problems and the challenges and the kind of complex, interconnected nature of our crises, we realized that perhaps the first step towards hope is dialogue. It ends at the point where people start a dialogue because we think that's the beginning.
The backpack that's part of the film, The Intersection, that came out of a lot of thinking about what would a future look like where instead of people collecting data and things in a very faceless way and presenting stories without any kind of responsibility. What happens if you then start to carry that data with you and you start to collect those stories in a very intimate
But
way?
you want to make a film,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
you also want to make products.
Yes.
Exactly, yeah,
Yes. Because
exactly.
we are makers as much as filmmakers, so we don't really see these boundaries. We really think that for people to be able to imagine a possible future, having something tactile and tangible as an artifact from that future can really be very evocative. The world has always been complex and will be more and more complex and turbulent, so we have a responsibility to address it and to show paths forward. That's our responsibility as creatives, filmmakers, designers, artists.
Hopefully we can inspire more designers to start to engage in some of the bigger questions around where we are and where we might want to get to and how we get there.
Do you call yourself activist?
I often use the term slow activism. As John says, sometimes we design questions, but we are using our work as a form of slow activism to critically engage people with questions.
When we first started, there was a lot of enthusiasm around technologies that we could see problems with at the time. And we wanted to create these cautionary tales to say, that yes, these things could be used for good, but they also have these potential problems within them. And then I think as the studio's progressed, we've seen a lot of those problems manifest in the world. So we felt more of a drive to look towards the kind of hopeful futures and say, what can we make from this? What can we make from this difficult situation we found ourselves in?
Yeah. And I suppose not to use the word hope lightly, because hope means confronting the challenges. So sometimes the work we do, which we think is hopeful, a lot of people still think it's dystopian and it's troubling. And actually what we think is that the fact that despite the climate crisis, people are gathered and are doing something about it is a sign of hope. The troubles we find ourselves in are not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah.
It's the way we address them and move through them is an act of hope.
Finally, about the More Than Human manifesto. Is this a kind of creating a new order?
I love how you've interpreted it. I'm going to have to chat with you more about that. The way it emerged was I was writing a talk for a conference, and we were thinking a lot about this. And we were doing a project called Mitigation of Shock, where we were growing a lot of species, living plants and stuff. And we started realizing very much that as a designer, normally the product is the final outcome. It's finished. You put it on the shelf and you sell it. When you're growing stuff, nature is capricious. It never finishes. There's no end. There's birth and death and life again. And the roots were suspended in water, and there was no perfect artifact as the outcome. I kind of started to put this A and B list together, saying, we're not saying stop doing what you're doing, but consider this other perspective. Fixing things with technology is not the answer to the problems. Maybe we need to nurture better communities, and from planning to gardening, from certainty to contingency, that things are changing, things are in flux. In a way, it's to say, let's start broadening our vocabulary. Let's not just keep shouting innovation. It's kind of mindless growth, and it comes at a cost that we're all paying right now. So what if it was replaced with resurgence, where you are aware of the circularity of products and their lives and what comes out of the earth? How do we give back?